Greetings and salutations, friends. So, orcs, or more correctly in the Warhammer fantasy terms, orcs and goblins. So, first up, this is one of the species that was actually based on another fantasy race. This was way back in the beginning of Warhammer, in the far distant past of the 80s. A sad time where we didn't even have colored television, where a bunch of British people sat down and decided to make a fantasy universe. One of the first races they created were the Orcs and Goblins, which were at the time based on the J.R.R. Tolkien Lord of the Rings orcs. Today, the two races don't have a whole lot of similarities left, but back in the very beginning, the Orcs of Middle-earth were essentially, well, the basic for the Orc race. So, the differences begins with the simple fact that while originally in the Hobbit, the Orcs were described as Orcs and Goblins, this was later changed into being just Orcs, so that by the time of the movies, they're just Orcs. There's no distinction between their size or disposition, except for the distinguishing factor of rank and allegiance. For example, the Uruk-hai were not considered a separate species of orc, they were simply just a different, what should I say, nation of orcs? A different race? They're not a separate species, just like black people are not a separate species from white people, etc. In Warhammer Fantasy, however, the Orc, or more correctly, the Greenskin race is divided into several subspecies, of which the Orcs are the largest and thereby the ones most likely to be in charge. Furthermore, we have Goblins, Gnoblars, Snotlings, and Hobgoblins. You could also argue that Squigs are part of the Greenskin race. However, while created by much the same process, the Squigs are a separate race entirely, kept by the Orcs more as, wildlife, I'd suppose, since, calling them domesticated animals would be quite a stretch. But for clarity's sake, we're just going to say that the Squigs are a separate race entirely, so you won't be hearing too much about them in this video. Instead, I will start out with the Orcs. Now, your average orc is generally taller and broader than the average human, with short legs and long arms in a simian fashion. Although, in stark contrast to ourselves and your average monkey, the orc spine arches rather severely near the top of its back, so that its head is essentially jutting out between its shoulder blades rather than on the top. These massive heads would maybe make you think that they have considerable brains, being so large, but the fact is that most of a greenskin's head is made up by its mouth, its jaws, its massive teeth, and very little of that is actually brain. Now, that is not to say that orcs are stupid, although, well, yes, by human standards they are pretty damn dumb, but they possess a certain animal cunning to them that means that they cannot be underestimated. While they may not have the abilities to create works of art or understand complex mathematics, they'd need neither of these to plant a chopper squarely between your eyes. Additionally, the orc physiology is quite different to that of our own. Their skin is far tougher, almost to the point of curd leather, and the workings of their internal organs, cells and biology, including their nerve endings, work vastly differently from that of your average human. The biggest difference being the simple fact that the orcs possess a vastly underdeveloped nervous system. This means that they are essentially worthless when it comes to conducting any task that requires any sort of finesse. An orc is practically incapable of just picking something small up, for example. He has the motory functions to close his hands, he has the motory functions to move his legs just like a human, but he doesn't have that finesse of touch that allows us to pick up, for example, an eggshell without breaking it. This does, of course, have its advantages. First and foremost, the orcs are virtually immune to pain. And additionally, their bodies are capable of shrugging off injuries that would kill a man. For example, an orc that gets his arm lopped off will still be more or less combat effective, except, of course, the fact that he's lacking an arm, so he's only going to be hitting you with one fist rather than two. But whereas something like this would almost certainly put a human on his back and quite likely kill him due to the sheer trauma of the injury, an orc can continue to fight quite happily. Of course, he can still bleed to death, but this is not something the orc actively considers. He does not see this massive injury as an imminent threat to himself. He is far more concerned with beating the shit out of whatever injured him than he is of, staying alive. Although that too is slightly incorrect, simply because the orc has no real concept of losing. The orc never even considers that he might actually get killed. He's perfectly fine with other orcs getting killed. He sees other orcs getting killed, so logically you would think that he understands that, well, other orcs can die, and me being an orc, I too could die. But no, his brain simply doesn't function at that level, whether through willful ignorance or simple stupidity. I'd like to draw a comparison between our own species here. For example, many of the African tribes that were fighting, for example, the British, the French, and every other European nation that decided to shit on that poor continent during the age of imperialism, had various traditions of magic. For example, the local tribe shaman would paint the warrior in some wonderful blue colors and claim that these wonderful blue colors would make him immune to the evil white devil's bullets. Now, of course, it didn't really work out that way, but at the same time, the warrior, being raised in this culture that told him from birth that yes, this blue paint will protect you from danger, could see other warriors get killed by bullets wearing the same blue paint, and he would simply think that, okay, he got killed because there was something wrong with the magic, not because the magic didn't work. And I'm not pulling this completely out of my ass here before you start going crazy. This is actually the results of several interrogations carried out by the British in particular, because they were starting to wonder why the local tribes were simply just running towards their gun lines. Because most other nations they had fought had at some point realized that, ooh, guns, bad. And so they got curious. And the orcs function in much the same way. They simply refuse to believe that they themselves could be killed, and the vital difference here being the simple fact that an orc is vastly tougher than a human, to the point where orc medical skills is, well, calling them medical skills is a horrible disservice to the practice. Because the orcs have doctors, or, well, they don't call them doctors, they call them pain boys. And the pain boys themselves are less interested in keeping their, well, patient alive than they are simply experimenting upon the fascinating subject that is the orc body. And their medical skills essentially extends to finding the lopped off limb, or any other lopped off limb that just happens to lay around, and then, if they're very generous, sewing it back on, or if they're a bit more pressed for time, going off to find a hammer and a bunch of nails and just hammering the thing on. And the orc body is so remarkably tough and has such incredible regenerative capabilities within their cellular structure that a lopped off limb that is hammered on with hammers and nails actually have a reasonable chance of attaching itself and becoming a more or less workable limb. Now, of course, this somewhat rudimentary surgery has some minor side effects and the limb is never going to be fully operational again, but it does work. Now, the other point I was trying to make is the fact that while the African tribes thought they had magic on their sides, the orcs actually have magic on their side. Because, of course, while in our world, regardless of how much you believe in something, that doesn't necessarily make it true. However, in the Warhammer world, with the way how chaos works, if enough orcs believe in something, it's going to come true. And the orcs have a fascinating little part of their psychology. The orcs seem to have, at some base point, a racially linked mind, allowing orc shamans to tap into the power of their fellow orcs' beliefs and wants, and channel them into magical power. So an orc shaman with 10 orcs around him isn't very powerful, he can't really cast any spells, he's essentially just a normal orc at that point. An orc shaman with 10,000 orcs around him, now he can start setting off some proper fireworks. And some of these flashy fireworks include the ability to make orcs tougher and give them essentially ward saves, which means that an orc can get shot by a bullet and not be injured. So, the last little note I'd like to add on the body of the orc is the fact they have an adrenaline-fueled metabolism, which means that they grow in size, strength, endurance, and, well, anger, the more adrenaline is pumped into their system. In other words, the more they fight, the angrier they are, and the longer they fight, and the longer they remain pissy, the bigger and thereby the more powerful they get. Because orc culture, and it is a horrible bastardized version of the word, is dominated by the concept of might makes right. There is essentially no law except for the very basic laws set down by the warlord, and even those are only, well, enforced by the warlord, and, well, thereby, there is no crime. If you have no system of law, well, you can't have a system of crime. If an orc feels wronged in any way, for example, if another orc stole his favorite pet goblin, he doesn't launch into a judicial process against the defendant. He walks up to the other orcs and kills him. Or gets killed. 1 out of 2. And as such, the entirety of orc leadership is essentially based around whoever is capable of beating the shit out of everyone else. And here comes in another little funny fact of the orc physiology. Because of their adrenaline-fueled metabolism, the orcs increase in size when excited, yeah? When they're wanting to fight someone. And, well, in a rank system where the only way to increase in stature is to beat the shit out of whoever is bigger than you, well, if you're thinking of beating him up, you're excited, right? You're preparing yourself for a fight, which means that an orc horde with a particularly big, bad, and kick-ass warboss is going to affect every single bloody orc in that horde to aspire for his position, thereby becoming bigger, stronger, and more violent until one of them can overcome the warboss. Now, of course, the warboss, being entirely aware of this, will keep an eye out for anyone who looks to be bulking up a little bit too much and promptly beat him back into his place. A fairly constant task, considering that his presence is essentially affecting every bloody orc under his banner, and this is also the primary reasons why the orcs cannot unite for any real period of time. The simple fact that if you do get a really kick-ass warboss, he's going to make all of the orcs around him even more kick-ass to the point that he's going to get overthrown. And so for an orc to actually unite a real number of orcs, he has to be a truly uniquely powerful individual. Like, for example, the Black Orc warlord Grimgor Ironhide. At this point in Warhammer history, the bastard is over 4 meters tall, and is weighing in somewhere around 500 kilograms of pure muscle. Luckily for the rest of the Warhammer world, Grimgor Ironhide has grown to the sheer size and aggressiveness that at this point, if he doesn't find someone else to fight every few hours, he's simply going to start killing whatever orcs are nearby. If a few days goes by without a battle, Grimgor Ironhide is going to be killing off the vast majority of his own army. So you can imagine that actually having a bunch of orcs rallying around this guy, while On one hand, they think that he's a great, big, awesome, kick-ass war boss, and he certainly is. On the other hand, there is enough of a spark of animal intelligence in those tiny nut-sized brain of theirs to go, oh shit, he just killed 15 of his own guys. Maybe I should be standing further away. So, now that I've given you a relatively good idea of an orc is, I will move on to the goblins. The goblins are among the smallest of the greenskin races. They are by far smaller than orcs and hobgoblins, and are of roughly equal size to the gnoblars, but bigger than snotlings. What they lack in brute force and size, though, they make up for in the fact that they are considerably more intelligent than your average ogre. Now, most of this intelligence comes from a low animal cruel cunning. So again, these aren't going to be winning the Nobel Prize in Science anytime soon, and will have some difficulties beating a 6-year-old human child in an algebra quiz, but they're still considerably more intelligent than the larger, more brutish cousins, the orcs. There are sub-factions of goblins, like for example the night goblins and forest goblins, with the main distinguishing factor being how independent they are from their orcish masters. For example, the forest goblins are practically independent of the orcs themselves, although they will happily serve as, well, warriors in a larger warg, and the night goblins have come to the point where they actually have goblin war bosses. Some of them are even powerful enough to command the loyalty of orcs, which you would think, being far bigger and far stronger than them, would have the ability to simply beat the little bugger up and become a warboss by himself. Which is why a goblin warlord has to be a sneaky, conniving, cruel and evil individual in the extreme, capable of controlling creatures like orcs, creatures that are entirely convinced of their own essential immortality, through fear and threat of pain and death. And considering that, well, orcs don't really think they can die, and they don't give much of a shit about fear or pain, so you can imagine just how goddamn scary this little goblin has to be. But the vast majority of goblins are under the control of their orc overlords, mostly used as a slave force and as cannon fodder in combat. Being far more finessed in their motory functions than orcs, they are capable of taking care of all of the little bullshitty tasks that the orcs don't really want to do themselves. For example, they are considerably better craftsmen than any orc could ever be, and although goblin craftsmanship is shoddy in the extreme, at least they can actually make something. So, to give you an example, while the goblins can at least make basic iron weaponry of extremely shoddy workmanship, likely to break at the first swing, granted, but they can make it. While the orcs, left to their own devices, end up much like the savage orcs, whose weaponry primarily consists of rocks tied to the end of sticks. So, while treated as a purely slave race, the goblins are invaluable to the orc horde as a whole, both as slave labor and occasionally as a light snack between meals. Now, the goblin body works in much the same way that an orc's does. However, being considerably smaller than the orcs, they also have considerably less muscle mass. Goblins are as vastly inferior to humans when it comes to sheer physical power as orcs are superior to humans. Additionally, while the orcs are extremely aggressive and forward creatures, the goblins, being much smaller, has developed far more of a cowardly, backstabbing kind of thinking, having developed a fairly basic but extremely effective method for survival. In essence, while the life of a goblin is extremely dangerous, most likely getting killed in battle, or, well, just killed by orcs, eaten by the orcs, eaten by the wildlife, eaten by their fellow goblins, etc., etc., they don't really give a shit as long as it happens to the other guy, as they so say. And while orcs are convinced of their own immortality, the goblins have seen far too much evidence suggesting the contrary to have any such illusions. And as such, while they do fight, technically, in battles, they will only actually fight if forced to by orc overlords, or if they are sure that they outnumber the other side by at least 10 to 1. There are some exceptions to this. There are particularly ferocious little goblins that rides wolves, for example. Only the biggest and baddest of goblins can actually tame, that's a pretty extreme and misleading word, control, I think is a better one, a wolf enough for it to be able to ride the wolf. Now, granted, if the goblin should at any point fall off the wolf, odds are the wolf is going to be having himself a snack. But as long as the goblins are able to provide other things for the wolf to munch on, the goblin is relatively safe, as long as it stays beyond the wolf's immediate jawline. In addition to riding wolves, the goblins have also used their low animal cunning to create a fair few interesting machines. For example, they were the ones who thought of the idea to stitch together beast hides to make wings for themselves, and while this most certainly does not allow a goblin to fly, it does allow a goblin to glide for a fair bit longer when, for example, launched by a catapult as a living, screaming projectile. They also invented a minor improvement to the orcish chariot, namely that, they added wheels to it. As while the orcs did manage to build themselves an essential chariot by, placing a bunch of planks on the ground and tying some boards to it, it was only when the goblins came around and suggested that they might want to add wheels to it that it became a real chariot. Now, of course, the first goblin to utter such a ridiculous suggestion was immediately beaten to death and eaten for having the sheer audacity to offer such a ridiculous idea. But after enough goblins had suggested it, and the orcs were nice and full and happily fed, the orcs figured it wasn't that bad of an idea after all. Moving on to another subspecies of greenskin, we have the gnoblars. The gnoblar are similar in almost every way with the goblin as to their basic physiology and biology. However, they have two distinct differences. The first is the color, which is mostly greenish blue or turquoise, and the other is the massive fat nose that would make any Jew proud. They are considered slightly larger than normal goblins, although a fair bit of that size comes in that wonderful little nasal cavity they have though, and slightly braver, but not by much. And not only similar in appearance, they also share their goblin cousins' cruelty and vicious nature, serving their ogre masters much like the goblins serve the orcs, by carrying out minor tasks of silliness that the ogres simply can't be bothered to do by themselves. Additionally, their ogre masters, having a well-developed taste for fine cuisine, have come to the realization that those wonderful fat bulbous noses of the gnoblars make for absolutely delicious treats. And while they mostly use them as a slave labor force, much like the orcs used the goblins, they also use them as pets and as, hamburgers. And here I have to mention another little funny aside. You see, the gnoblars who are considered as pets of an ogre are considerably higher up in the social rank order of the gnoblar society. A ogre's pet essentially has the protection of his ogre masters, and so the other gnoblars are not going to want to mess with him for fear of getting eaten by his boss. However, there is one small catch that any gnoblar that wants to become an ogre's pet has to overcome. Namely, the fact that to brand a gnoblar as his, the ogre takes a bite out of the gnoblar's ear. And gnoblars being particularly delicious little creatures, it is very, very hard for an ogre to actually stop eating. And so ends the ambitions of many would-be pet gnoblars. Then there are the snotlings, another subspecies of greenskin. The snotlings are by far the tiniest of orcs and are considered to be essentially pets by the vast majority of the orcs, and are therefore afforded a fair bit more, safety is a strong word, but I guess basic protection than their goblin cousins. Now, while being in many cases much the same as goblins when it comes to their basic biology and physiology, the Gnoblins possess pea-sized brains and behave very much like extremely enthusiastic and uncontrollable puppies. Granted, extremely toothy, retarded, and smelly puppies, but puppies nonetheless. In fact, the only thing that allows you to really distinguish a snotling from something like a puppy is the fact that while the puppy is a reasonably loyal creature, the snotling will steal anything that is not nailed to the ground, and even if it is nailed down, they will try and find some way to either unnail it or to steal the thing, the nails, and whatever it is nailed to. Now, there's not that much to say about the snotlings other than the fact that they're wonderful little puppy-ass creatures. So instead, I'll read a little passage to you from the Orc Army book about snotlings. Now, I will be reading this in the Orcish language, which I will describe shortly, so excuse me for any upcoming bleeding from your ears. If I find out who ate me favourite snotty, there's gonna be some trouble, A's. I was saving him, I was. Dead clever little fella. He could fetch it right quick, course. Was never what I asked for, but you could see he was eager. Poor little fella. Orc Warlord, Grisgut's Bad Axe. Now, before I move on to the last subspecies of greenskin, a quick note on the greenskin language. The greenskins essentially communicate with one another through a colorful mix of broken human language, Reichspiel, the official language of the Empire, curse words, and blows to the head. There is one particular tribe of savage orc that is said to have a vocabulary consisting entirely of the word wag, being the orcish war cry, with variants in volume, pitch, and accents making up for individual words. They even have a form of written language, which resembles Egyptian hieroglyphs, although, while Egyptian hieroglyphs was a written language of some sophistication, the orcs would rather get their ideas across by painting pictures of orcs doing horrible things to other orcs on whatever flat surface is readily available. And so, if two orcs read these scribblings, you will have two orcs with vastly different opinions on what was written on that wall, which will usually lead to the orcs beating the shit out of each other, and whatever orcs walks away with the least broken bones, or, alive, well, he had the right interpretation. So, the last of the greenskin races, the hobgoblin. Now, the biggest distinguishing factor between hobgoblins and normal goblins is the fact that the hobgoblins are far more of an independent race than the goblins are. They do not consider orcs as their natural allies, or, in most cases, their natural superiors. Instead, they usually serve either their own warlords, having founded basically a nation of their own known as the Great Khanate Kingdom of the Steppes, which is essentially a Hunnic horde, except instead of, humans riding horses, you've got vast hordes of goblin wolf riders. And a fair few of them have also sold themselves into servitude, but not slavery, mind you. These are not a workforce, these are essentially mercenary soldiers of the Chaos Dwarfs. And while the Chaos Dwarfs are fairly brutal overlords, they're still less horrifying to work for than the Orcs. Now, the primary reason for why hobgoblins and the greenskins in general consider each other to be the biggest assholes on the entire planet is the fact that during the Great Greenskin Uprising of the Darklands, where the greenskin slave population of the Chaos Dwarfs all rose up in rebellion to throw off the shackles of servitude imposed upon them by the Chaos Dwarfs, the hobgoblins chose to rather stay loyal to their Chaos Dwarf overlords and turned on the other goblins. and they were rewarded by being made a servant race rather than slaves. They were given a fair few rights and, well, honors within the Chaos Dwarfs faction, becoming essentially a, well, not respected, but generally accepted part of their armies. Of course, several hobgoblins also chose to strike out on their own, forming the nation of the Hobgoblin Khanate, under the infamous Hobgoblin Khan. And these hobgoblins are vastly different to their goblin cousins, as they have grown up in an environment without orcs, however still possessing the unique metabolism of their greenskin cousins, means that without any orcs to continuously beat down the goblin populations, these goblins have grown to such size and ferocity that they are now almost the equal of orcs themselves, riding massive wolves specifically bred for war, and whereas the wolves and goblin combo of the basic goblin wolf riders is at best an alliance of convenience, the hobgoblins and their wolves are trusted companions, well, as trusted a companion as anything a goblin could ever have, but considerably more so than the normal goblin wolf riders, and have, through their ferocity and wonderfully skirmish-heavy tactics, grown to be the largest single nation within the Warhammer world. And luckily for the dwarfs and the men of the Empire, between themselves and the Hobgoblin Khanate stands the Chaos Dwarfs, the Orc hordes of the Badlands, and the Mountains of Morn filled with ogres. It's simply far easier for the hobgoblins to keep heading into Cathay and the lands of the East than it is to turn around and try to get to the soft lands of the Empire, as if they go north they have to trek through the Chaos Wastes and fight the Chaos versions of Mongolians, which are even more horrifying than the hobgoblins, or they have to head through the Mountains of Morn, and then the Chaos Dwarves, and then the Orcs, and then they've got to fight the Dwarves before they arrive in the Empire, so Hobgoblin Khan has no immediate plans of attempting that particular journey. So, to finish up the various types of greenskin, I will once again read to you a small excerpt from the army book. You know what they say, Talker. Lucky at dice, unlucky at getting back to your own tent without having a nasty accident. Gordo's backstabber at a game of dice to Taka, another hobgoblin. Now that I've given you a reasonable understanding of what the greenskins are, let's talk briefly about their society, and this is going to be brief indeed because the orcs don't have much of a society. As I mentioned earlier, their hierarchy is essentially based entirely on who is the biggest, the baddest, and the strongest, or failing that, the one able to kill off any competition with treachery, backstabbing, and other conniving things. They have essentially no communal structure, living in dozens of smaller tribes scattered across the Badlands, or pretty much any other part of the Warhammer world really. There are very, very few areas indeed where there are not orcs. Some tribes are purely goblins, some tribes are purely orcs, although the vast majority of them are mixed tribes for reasons that I've explained earlier. The only uniting feature, well, even that's not much of a uniting feature, is their religion, their belief in Gork and Mork, the twin deities of the Orc race, where one is cunningly brutal and the other is brutally cunning, but the greenskins can never agree on which is which. In fact, the gods are so closely related and so intermingled that you could very easily come to the conclusion that it's not two gods, it's one god with a split personality disorder. But nobody really knows, seeing as the only ones who are capable of communicating with the gods are the orc and goblin shamans, which communicate with their gods by getting themselves shit-faced on mushroom brew and various other funny and interesting chemicals that somewhat affect their faculties. So that when they come out of their trance state after having a chat with Gork and Mork, if they actually manage to say anything that even vaguely resembles the somewhat crude excuse for language the orcs have, it can usually be interpreted in at least 75 different ways. Whereupon the orcs that heard this prophecy, for lack of a better word, will start beating the shit out of each other, arguing about which interpretation of the prophecy is correct, and whichever faction within the tribe manages to beat up all of the other factions, well, again, much like in their interpretation of language, the last man standing has the correct interpretation. Again, I'll give you an example, though not from Warhammer Fantasy. This is actually from Warhammer 40k, which also has orcs and goblins. So you will excuse the slight bastardization here, but it really does speak to the orc mindset. So, you have the crew of an orcish bomber airplane. A crude machine at the best of times, crewed by a bunch of orcs and goblins. Now, this thing has multiple gun turrets spread haphazardly around the fuselage. So, one of the goblins operating one of the guns asks the captain a question. Hey boss, how do I know if I'm shooting friendlies or if I'm shooting enemies? Because orc aircraft don't really have any distinguishable markings on them, so this being a fight between orcs, there's really no way of telling one orc aircraft from the other orc aircraft. To which the captain, of course, gives the extremely simple answer. Well, Goblin, that's a very simple question. If you fire at them and you hit them, they're an enemy. If you fire at them and you miss, that was a friendly. Did that answer your question? To which the goblin happily replies while blasting away with his machine guns, yes boss, much better now boss. So as you can see, logic does not really occupy any part of the greenskin brain, so when it comes to religious fanaticism and the interpretation of prophecies, well, they're orcs. They'll find a way. There is, however, one thing that can unify several orcish tribes, that being a war. Now, if one orcish tribe encounters another orcish tribe, the two sides will launch into a delicate and well thought out game of diplomacy, crafting intricate and nuanced proposals to send to one each other, to try and negotiate rites of passage, maybe terms of an armistice or even an alliance, and who the fuck am I kidding? They attack each other and brutally beat the shit out of one another. Whichever tribe is left standing, well, they were clearly in the right, and therefore they absorb the other tribe, now having been taught a proper lesson that they were wrong and the other guys were right, and now they are joined in beautiful harmony, or, well, as beautiful and harmonious relationship as any orc is ever capable of having with another orc. Now, due to this, what you often end up having is that tribes will start growing bigger and bigger and bigger as they find more and more other orc tribes and teaching them the error of their ways. Eventually, the orc war boss will grow to a sufficient stature, and having gathered enough orcs around him, he will set off with the goal of declaring a war, which is, you could almost call it a greenskin crusade, although it doesn't fight for any such lofty ideals as religion or anything. It's just that, well, I've gathered up all the orcs around here, I don't really have any other orcs to fight, so let's set off in some random direction to find someone else to fight. And once a war of decent size has been declared, the word of this crusade, for lack of a better term, will spread amongst the orc population, and orcs will come from far and wide to join up in the war, because, well, the war's clearly heading to someplace interesting, and no self-respecting orc would want to be left out of a nice big fight. Now, in these early stages, there is every possibility that this war will simply run into a bigger tribe of orcs and get completely and utterly destroyed, or that they'll throw themselves at the dwarves and get blasted into tiny screaming bits on the dwarfish gun lines, or maybe wander into the mountains of Morn, where they will fill many, many ogre bellies. or perhaps they'll head south into the lands of the Tomb Kings. Whichever path they choose, the vast majority of these wargs are simply destroyed and don't really make any impact on anything. But every now and then, a particularly large and violent war boss will arise forth from the Orcish ranks and organize a proper war, gathering hundreds of thousands of orcs to his banner and setting off to ravage the civilized world. These wargs have inflicted some pretty damn serious damage on the civilized world, at one point almost destroying the human empire, and having been responsible for the sacking of several dwarfish Karaks. But luckily, such events are pretty damn rare, as even just getting a war off the ground is hard enough. And again, the orcs are pretty much their own biggest enemy, as any warlord with any hope of organizing and running a proper-sized war has to be, as said earlier, a truly remarkably big, powerful and violent individual, as the more orcs he gathers, the more orcs are looking to take his job. So I'm pretty much done with the Orcs and Goblins lore side here, so I'll finish it up with their origin story. Now, no one really knows how the Orcs came to be on the Warhammer world, but the generally accepted fluff reason amongst Warhammer fans is that they were brought along on the spaceships of the Old Ones, the creators of the Warhammer world, so to say, the ones who originally seeded it with the life forms like the lizardmen, the dwarves and elves, etc. Now, whether or not the orcs were one of the Old Ones' creations, or merely an accident, some form of alien spore stuck in their spaceship, for example, we don't know. On one hand, it seems strange for the Old Ones to seed such a violent and aggressive race on their planet, as it would guarantee that the Orcs would try and brutally murder everyone else. On the other hand, we really don't know much about the Old Ones. Maybe they were just a bunch of crazy-ass sadists that would love to watch the world burn. So in that respect, any theory is as good as any other. But essentially, the orcs are space spores that turned into violent, brutal monsters and are now trying to eat every other creature in the Warhammer world. Lastly, the orcs do not reproduce in the normal way that most races reproduce, like for example us humans. They reproduce more like flowers, in that they spread their orcish spores anywhere they are through breathing, farting, etc. And these spores turn into mushrooms, which are used by the orcs as food, and will serve as an incubator of sorts out of which the greenskins themselves will grow. So, I hope this video has been at least somewhat informative as to what the orcs and goblins are in the Warhammer world. Next up, of course, I will do the army video, which again I will split into heroes and units, and I will probably do a tactics video on this too, just to give a general impression of how the orcs fight. So, look forward to that. Thank you very much for watching. I have been Arch, and have a good day.